Think about the last thing you ate. Not a meal, necessarily. A snack, a drink, whatever it was. Now I want you to think about whether it had sugar in it. And if you're not sure, if you'd actually have to check the label, that's exactly the problem I want to talk about today. Because sugar is no longer just a sweetener. It hasn't been for decades. It is an ingredient in bread, in pasta sauce, in salad dressing, in crackers, in yogurt, protein bars, in ketchup, in coleslaw, in deli meat. It is in things that do not taste sweet. It is in things that are marketed as healthy. It is, in the modern food supply, essentially everywhere. And it got there not by accident, not by consumer demand, but through one of the most deliberate and well-documented campaigns of corporate scientific manipulation in the history of the food industry. Today, we are going to tell that story. All of it. From the sugarcane fields of ancient India to the Harvard scientists who took money to lie to you, to the ingredient label on whatever you ate an hour ago. This is the episode we've been building toward. Heads up, you might not be happy with what we uncover. This is Eat or Die, stories from the human table, from Renegade Health Group. I'm Zach Sykes. We've done protein, grains, magnesium, beer. All of them fascinating, all of them important, none of them quite like this. Sugar is the episode where everything we've discussed so far converges. The blood sugar spikes we talked about in the grains episode, the insulin resistance, the metabolic dysfunction, the way the food industry operates, the gap between what official guidelines say and what the research actually shows. It's all here, and it's been here, hiding in plain sight for a long time. Let's go. Sugar, in the common usage, refers to sucrose, the white crystalline substance in the bowl on your kitchen table. But sugar is actually a family of molecules, and understanding the difference between them matters more than most people realize. Glucose is the body's primary fuel. Every carbohydrate you eat is ultimately broken down into glucose. Your brain runs on it, your muscles run on it. It is the baseline currency of biological energy. Every cell in your body can use glucose. Fructose is glucose's twin. Same molecular formula, different structure. It tastes sweeter than glucose. It occurs naturally in fruit, in small quantities, alongside fiber that moderates its absorption. And it is metabolized almost exclusively by the liver, a fact that becomes critically important in a few minutes when the professor arrives. Sucrose, table sugar, is one glucose molecule bonded to one fructose molecule. When you eat it, digestive enzymes split that bond immediately. You get half glucose, half fructose. Every gram of table sugar is half a gram of the molecule your liver has to process alone. High fructose corn syrup is a processed sweetener derived from cornstarch, consisting of roughly 55% fructose and 45% glucose. It was developed in the 1960s, became commercially dominant in the 70s and 80s as corn subsidies made it dramatically cheaper, and is now present in an extraordinary percentage of processed food. The current nutritional boogeyman of the sugar family, its metabolic effects are, for practical purposes, essentially identical to sucrose. The distinction everyone yells about matters more politically than biochemically. Where does sugar come from? Sugarcane, a giant tropical grass, has been cultivated in New Guinea for at least 10,000 years. Sugar beets, the other major commercial source, were developed as a crop in 18th century Europe. Corn, for high fructose corn syrup, is primarily American. Typical. The history of how these sources became global commodities is in significant part a history of exploitation, coercion, and human suffering that still echoes today. The story of sugar begins, as so many stories do, in a place of extraordinary natural abundance. New Guinea, 8 to 10,000 years ago. Sugarcane grows wild in the tropical lowlands. The people who live there chew the stalks for the sweet juice inside. It is a pleasure, not yet a commodity, not yet a crop, just a plant that tastes extraordinary in a world where sweetness is very rare. Sweetness, for most of human history, was a signal. It meant ripe fruit. It meant calories. It meant safety. Unripe, potentially toxic fruit is bitter. Sweet fruit is ready to eat. Simple. The human brain evolved to find sweetness intensely rewarding for a reason. In a world of scarcity, the pursuit of sweet things kept us alive. Sugarcane cultivation spread westward over millennia through Southeast Asia into India, where Sanskrit texts from around 500 BCE describe sugar crystals as khanda, the word from which we get candy. Indian chemists developed the process of crystallizing cane juice into a solid, portable, storable form. This was a technological breakthrough of the first order. Suddenly, sugar could be traded, transported, and taxed. Alexander the Great's generals, reaching the Indus Valley in 327 BCE, reported encountering a reed that produced honey without bees. They were describing sugarcane. They brought samples back west, and the Mediterranean world was introduced to something it had never tasted. For the next 1,000 years, sugar moved slowly westward through Persia into the Arab world and eventually into Europe via the Crusades. The Crusaders encountered sugar in the Levant and brought it back to Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. It arrived as a luxury so expensive it was sold by the gram at apothecaries, used as a medicine and a spice, displayed at the tables of the wealthy as a status symbol. In medieval Europe, sugar was kept under lock and key, literally. Noble households stored their sugar in locked boxes, called sugar coffers, alongside other spices and precious commodities. A recipe calling for a pound of sugar was the culinary equivalent of calling for a pound of saffron today. It was theater. It was wealth made edible. This is important context for what comes next. For almost all of human history, sugar was exceedingly rare. The human body adapted to a world where concentrated sweetness was exceptional. What was about to happen, the transformation of sugar from a locked box luxury to the most abundant additive in the global food supply, was, in human development terms, nearly instantaneous, and our biology was not ready for it. The story of how sugar became cheap is inseparable from one of the greatest atrocities in human history. There is no way to tell it gently, and I am not going to try. By the 15th century, Portuguese and Spanish colonizers had established sugarcane plantations on Atlantic islands, the Canaries, Madeira, using enslaved African labor. The plantation model worked. Sugar became extraordinarily profitable, and when Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, the colonial powers recognized immediately that the Caribbean climate was ideal for cane cultivation at a scale that the Atlantic islands couldn't approach. The transatlantic slave trade, in significant part, was a sugar operation. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. Of those, roughly 40%, or approximately 5 million people, went to work in sugar colonies in Brazil and the Caribbean. The mortality rate on sugar plantations was catastrophic. In some colonies, the enslaved population died faster than it could be replaced through natural reproduction. The trade responded by shipping more people. The economics of sugar were, from the perspective of plantation owners and colonial governments, far more important than the lives of the people producing it. Haiti, then Saint-Dominique, France's most profitable colony, produced roughly 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee by the late 18th century. It did so on the labor of nearly 500,000 enslaved people living in conditions of extraordinary brutality. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, the only successful slave revolt in history that produced an independent nation, began in a sugarcane field. The people who made France rich with sugar burned the plantations and fought their way to freedom at enormous cost. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery throughout its empire in 1833. But it did not abolish sugar. It shifted to indentured labor. Workers from primarily India and China brought to the colonies under contracts that amounted in practice to a different form of coercion. The sugar kept flowing. The price kept falling. And as it fell, consumption in Europe began to rise. In 1700, the average Englishman consumed approximately 4 pounds of sugar per year. By 1800, that number had risen to 18 pounds. By 1900, it was 90 pounds. The democratization of sugar, its transformation from aristocratic luxury to working-class staple, was built on the backs of enslaved and indentured people across 3 centuries and multiple continents. The next time someone tells you that sugar is just calories, remember that those calories have a history, a very specific, a very bloody history. By the early 20th century, sugar was cheap, abundant, and embedded in the food supply in ways that would have been unrecognizable to a medieval European who kept theirs under lock and key. The industrialization of food processing, canning, packaging, preserving, created a new problem: palatability. Processed food without enhancement tastes flat, metallic, very unpleasant. Sugar fixed that. It rounded off harsh flavors, extended shelf life in some applications, and triggered the reward response in consumers reliably enough that food manufacturers began adding it to products where sweetness was not the primary goal: bread, soup, condiments, cured meats. Then came high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup was developed by Japanese researchers in the 1960s and commercialized in the United States in the 1970s. Its timing was not coincidental. The Nixon administration, facing political pressure over rising food prices, tasked then Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz with solving the cost problem. He restructured American agricultural policy to massively subsidize corn production. What does that mean? Corn became extraordinarily cheap. The industrial conversion of that cheap corn into an even cheaper sweetener was a natural consequence. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup. The American food supply was flooded with an inexpensive, intensely sweet, highly shelf-stable sweetener that could go into virtually anything. And it did. Per capita sugar consumption in the United States peaked in the late 1990s at approximately 150 pounds per person per year. 150 pounds. Let that sit for a moment. Now we're arriving at the part of this story that should make you genuinely angry. Because it is not speculation. It is documented. It's in the archives, and it was published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2016 for the world to read. In 2016, Kristen Kearns, Laura Schmidt, and Stanton Glantz, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, published a paper titled Sugar Industry and Coronary Heart Disease Research, a historical analysis of internal industry documents. The documents they analyzed had been sitting in university archives for decades, largely unexamined. Here's what those documents showed. In 1964, the Sugar Research Foundation, the lobbying and research arm of the American sugar industry, became aware of emerging research linking sugar consumption to coronary heart disease and other chronic conditions. Their internal documents show clearly that they recognized this as an existential threat to their industry. Their response was not to investigate whether the science was correct. Their response was to fund scientists to produce research that shifted blame away from sugar and on to dietary fat. In 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard scientists, D. Mark Hegsted, Robert McGandy, and Frederick Stair, the equivalent of approximately $50,000 in today's money, to produce a literature review on diet and heart disease. The SRF reviewed the paper before publication. The paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967. It minimized the evidence linking sugar to heart disease and emphasized dietary fat as the primary culprit. None of the authors disclosed their funding from the sugar industry. Now, it was not legally required at the time, but it was a conflict of interest of the most direct kind. Scientists being paid by an industry to produce conclusions favorable to that industry? It was hidden from the readers of one of the world's most prestigious medical journals. D. Mark Hegstead went on to become the head of nutrition at the United States Department of Agriculture. In 1977, he was the lead author of the first dietary goals for the United States, the federal guidelines that told Americans to reduce dietary fat. The low-fat dietary advice that dominated American public health guidance for the next 30 years and that contributed to the replacement of fat in processed foods with sugar traces a direct line to a Harvard scientist who had been paid by the sugar industry 12 years earlier to reach exactly that conclusion. Now, the food industry did not invent this strategy. They borrowed it from tobacco, which had been running the same playbook, funding research, manufacturing doubt, buying scientific credibility since the 1950s. In fact, some of the same PR firms worked for both. Some of the same strategies were explicitly discussed in their internal documents. John Yudkin, a British physiologist and professor at Queen Elizabeth College, London, spent the 1960s building a rigorous scientific case that sugar, specifically fructose, was the primary dietary driver of heart disease, also obesity and metabolic dysfunction. His 1972 book, Pure, White, and Deadly, laid out that case for a general audience with uncomfortable clarity. What happened? The sugar industry attacked him systematically. They funded researchers to rebut his work, wrote letters to journals questioning his methodology, and worked to undermine his credibility in the scientific community. By the time Yudkin died in 1995, his work had been largely marginalized. The fat hypothesis dominated. The sugar industry had won. And we are still living with the consequences of that victory. The professor is in. 3 mechanisms, no detours. Let's be precise. Sugar's hold on human behavior is not a matter of willpower. It's a matter of neuropharmacology. Understanding this is not an excuse, it's a map. When you consume sugar, glucose enters the bloodstream and reaches the brain. In the brain's primary reward center, dopamine is released. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter of anticipation and reward. It is the same system activated by cocaine, by gambling, by social media notifications. It evolved to reinforce behaviors that promote survival, eating calorie-dense food being the most fundamental of those behaviors. The problem is that repeated stimulation of dopamine pathways by an artificially concentrated stimulus, refined sugar, delivering glucose faster and at a higher concentration than any natural food source, triggers a compensatory response. The brain downregulates its dopamine receptors. It becomes less sensitive to the signal. You need more of the stimulus to get the same response. This is the neurological definition of tolerance. It's the same process that occurs with addictive substances. Research using fMRI imaging has shown that the brains of people who consume high amounts of sugar show reward circuit activation patterns similar to those seen in substance use disorders. Animal studies, where the confounds of human psychology can be controlled, have demonstrated compulsive sugar-seeking behavior, withdrawal symptoms upon sugar removal, and binging patterns that mirror drug addiction models. This does not mean sugar is heroin. It means sugar is not simply a matter of choosing to eat less of it. The neurological machinery driving overconsumption is real. It's documented, and it was exploited deliberately by an industry that had internal research showing exactly this. So the mechanism that really should alarm you the most is the one most people have never heard explained clearly. Glucose, as we've established, is metabolized by virtually every cell in the body. It enters cells through insulin-mediated glucose transporters. The whole body shares the load. Fructose is different. Fructose is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver. There are no insulin-mediated transporters for fructose in peripheral tissues. When you consume fructose, whether it's from table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, agave syrup, or any other source, your liver receives it essentially unregulated, in proportion to how much you consumed. In small quantities from whole fruit with fiber slowing absorption, the liver handles fructose without difficulty. In the quantities delivered by the modern food supply, where added sugar appears in nearly 75% of packaged foods, and per capita consumption is measured in the tens of pounds annually, the liver is overwhelmed. When the liver receives more fructose than it can process into glycogen for storage, it converts the excess to fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis, literally, new fat creation. That fat is initially stored in the liver itself. Fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was essentially unknown as a clinical diagnosis before the 1980s. It now affects an estimated 25% of the global adult population and up to 40% of Americans. It is the most common liver condition in the developed world, and its rise maps almost precisely onto the rise of high fructose corn syrup in the food supply. The metabolic consequences of chronic fructose overload extend beyond the liver. Elevated triglycerides, reduced HDL cholesterol, increased uric acid, a driver of gout and a contributor to hypertension, increased visceral fat, the metabolically active fat stored around organs, which is more dangerous than subcutaneous fat by every meaningful measure. Fructose, consumed at the doses the modern food supply delivers, it's not a sweetener. It is a straight liver toxin. The dose we're getting is poison, and that dose currently is too high. We touched on insulin resistance in the grains episode. Here it is again. Because sugar's contribution to it is more direct, more severe, and more urgent than any other dietary factor. Every time blood glucose rises, the pancreas releases insulin. Insulin's job is to signal cells to take up glucose, or clear it from the bloodstream. In a healthy metabolic state, cells respond to insulin efficiently, blood sugar rises, insulin is released, glucose is cleared, insulin falls. The system resets. With chronic sugar overconsumption, this system degrades. Cells, particularly muscle cells and liver cells, are exposed to elevated insulin signals so frequently that they begin to downregulate their response. They become insulin resistant. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin, and for a while, this works. Blood sugar stays controlled through sheer force of pancreatic output. But the pancreatic beta cells, the ones that actually produce the insulin, they're under continuous stress. Over years and decades, they begin to fail. The clinical progression runs insulin resistance to prediabetes to type 2 diabetes. Approximately 96 million American adults, more than 1 in 3, currently have prediabetes. 38 million have type 2 diabetes. The majority of both groups have dietary sugar overconsumption as a significant contributing factor, and they don't even realize it. Insulin resistance does not stop at blood sugar regulation. Chronically elevated insulin promotes fat storage, inhibits fat burning, drives systemic inflammation, contributes to hormonal dysregulation, and is associated with increased risk of certain cancers. Because insulin is a growth factor, and cancer cells respond to growth factors. The downstream consequences of a chronically dysregulated insulin system touch virtually every system in the body. This is the metabolic syndrome, the cluster of conditions that include abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL, elevated fasting glucose. They appear together because they share a common upstream driver. And that driver, in most cases, is a diet chronically high in refined sugar and refined carbohydrates. John Yudkin spent his career trying to tell us, and they paid people to make sure we didn't listen. The professor's a little worked up. I hope you can see why. Now let's make this useful. The goal of this section is not to make you afraid of food. Fear is not a sustainable nutritional strategy. The goal is to give you 3 practical tools that will, if you use them, meaningfully change your relationship with sugar. Not through willpower, through information. The distinction between naturally occurring sugar and added sugar is the most important line in the nutrition conversation, and the food industry has worked very hard to blur it. Naturally occurring sugar, in whole fruit, in vegetables, in plain dairy, comes packaged with fiber, water, vitamins, and minerals that moderate absorption and provide genuine nutritional value. The fructose in an apple arrives with pectin fiber that slows its transit through the gut, dramatically reducing the liver's exposure rate. The sugar in whole food is not the problem. Added sugar, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, agave, honey, maple syrup, and the 50-odd other names it appears under on ingredient labels, arrives without those moderating factors. Hits faster, higher, and harder. That's what we're targeting. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 25 grams of added sugar per day for women and 36 grams for men. These are the official guidelines, and they're not particularly aggressive. The effective target for meaningful metabolic benefit, based on research rather than politics of dietary guidelines, it's closer to 25 grams per day for most adults, regardless of sex, with a lower target of 15 to 20 grams for anyone with insulin resistance, prediabetes, or metabolic syndrome. For reference, a single 12-ounce can of regular soda contains approximately 39 grams of added sugar. One serving of most flavored yogurts, 15 to 25 grams. A tablespoon of ketchup has 4 grams. Heck, a single serving of many commercial salad dressings has 5 to 8 grams. The numbers add up faster than most people expect. In foods, most people don't think of as sweet. Now, we discussed the glycemic index in the grains episode. How quickly a food raises your blood sugar relative to pure glucose. Glycemic load refines that concept by accounting for portion size. A food can have a high glycemic index, but a low glycemic load if you eat a small amount of it. A food can have a moderate glycemic index, but a high glycemic load if your portion is too big. For practical navigation, think in terms of glycemic load, rather than in glycemic index. The target for a single meal is a glycemic load below 20. For a full day, below 100. Low glycemic load foods, like vegetables and legumes, whole fruits, most whole grains, proteins and fats, should form the base of the diet. Medium glycemic load foods, whole grain breads, pasta in moderate portions, most whole starchy vegetables, they're fine in context. But high glycemic load foods, I think you know what these are: sugary drinks, refined grain products, desserts, most ultra-processed snacks, those should be the exception, not the staple. You do not need to calculate glycemic load for every meal. That would be tedious. You do need to internalize the principle. Foods that spike blood sugar fast and high repeatedly across years of eating cause metabolic damage. Foods that raise blood sugar slowly and modestly do not. Choose accordingly. Now here's the simplest possible framework for navigating sugar in the real world. 3 tiers. Tier 1, eat freely. Natural sugar in whole food. This includes whole fruit, vegetables, plain dairy. These contain sugar, but they also contain everything that moderates it. Don't fear the apple. Don't avoid the sweet potato. The fiber, water, and nutrient density of whole food changes everything about how its sugar behaves in your body. No whole food containing sugar has been shown to drive metabolic disease in any research literature. None. Tier 2, eat thoughtfully. These are minimally processed sugar sources. Honey, pure maple syrup, dates, and similarly minimally processed sweeteners are still added sugar. They still count toward your daily target. They still deliver fructose to your liver without the moderating fiber of whole fruit. But they do come with trace minerals, and in the case of honey, some antimicrobial compounds. Use them deliberately, in small quantities for specific purposes, not as a license to sweeten everything. And then tier 3. Minimize these aggressively. This is the category driving the crisis: added sugar in processed food. Sugary beverages, soda, sweetened juice, energy drinks, flavored coffee drinks are the single largest source of added sugar in the American diet, and the category with the most consistent evidence of harm. Liquid sugar bypasses satiety signals entirely. You do not compensate for liquid calories by eating less. Eliminate these first, before anything else. Also, ultra-processed foods that have added sugar, packaged snacks, flavored yogurts, breakfast cereals, sauces, condiments, processed meats, they're the hidden category. Read your labels. If sugar, under any of its 50 names, appears in the first 3 ingredients of something that has no business being sweet, put it back. The food industry, by the way, is not required to call sugar sugar. It can call it sucrose, glucose, fructose, dextrose, maltose, lactose, galactose, high fructose corn syrup solids, fruit juice concentrate, evaporated cane juice, cane sugar, raw sugar, turbinado sugar, muscovado, coconut sugar, agave nectar, agave syrup, maple syrup, honey, molasses, barley malt, rice syrup, oat syrup, carob syrup. Okay, I'm not going to keep reading those. There's like several dozen other names. They're all sugar. They all count. The rule is simple. If you can't pronounce it or recognize it, search it. If it ends in ose, it's a sugar. If it's a syrup, it's a sugar. If the label lists multiple sweeteners, which sneakily distributes them across the ingredient list so none appear near the top, do the math. You're not being paranoid. You are reading accurately a label that was designed to obscure. Now, I want to be careful here, because this episode has been heavy, and I don't want to leave you with despair. Sugar is not poison in the way that arsenic is poison. It's not acutely lethal at normal doses. What it is, consumed at the quantities the modern food supply encourages, is a slow and cumulative stressor on our systems. Metabolic, neurological, specifically hepatic. That's your liver. They were not designed to handle this dose. The good news is that metabolic damage from sugar is largely reversible, particularly in its earlier stages. Insulin sensitivity improves within weeks of significantly reducing added sugar. Liver fat decreases, triglycerides fall, energy stabilizes. The brain's reward circuitry recalibrates, often very quickly. John Yudkin was right. He was right in 1972, and they spent decades and significant money making sure you didn't know that. Now you do. Eat accordingly. That's episode 5 of Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table. I'm Zach Sykes, Renegade Health Group. If this episode made you angry, good. That anger is appropriate. Directed at your grocery list, not at yourself. The system was designed to make this hard. Knowing that it was designed makes it a little easier to navigate. Share this one. It matters. Find us, Renegade Health Group, on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. Leave a review if you've got a minute. And if you want to support our work and keep us ad-free, find us on Patreon. We've got show notes, schedules, and I'll even do a special episode if you request it. Next episode, and I promise this will be a genuine palate cleanser after today, we're talking about potatoes. The most maligned vegetable in the modern diet. The food that saved Europe from starvation, fed the Irish for 2 centuries, and has been unfairly caught in the crossfire of every low-carb debate for 30 years. The potato deserves better. We're going to give it better. Until then, eat well. Read labels. And remember, the apple is fine. It was always fine.